Welcome, all of you. It's a great pleasure to welcome here Professor Amalia Arvaniti. I'm talking on behalf of the Speech Prosody Special Interest Group Board. And today, Professor Amalia Arvaniti will talk about how to handle variability in the study of intonation. Professor Amalia Arvaniti is a phonetician and laboratory phonologist interested in all types of phenomena in the study of speech, with a focus on prosody and prosodic variation, and a particular interest in the production and perception of intonation and rhythm. Her current research focuses on intonation and seeks to provide an integrated phonological model that takes into consideration phonetics on the one hand and the pragmatics of intonation on the other hand. Thank you so much, Amalia, for being here to talk to us about intonational variability. The floor is with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. I have tried to make the talk as accessible as possible. Very famous last words. We tried everything. Now the slides don't seem to move. Okay. So the plan of this talk is, first of all, to provide some intonation essentials, and that will be a kind of lengthy introduction because I think we have a lot of different models of intonation and we use terms in intonation in different ways. So I want to clarify the theoretical framework within which this work is couched. I will present the problem, which is a test case for the approach that we take in my project, Sprint. And the test case is the English high star versus low high star accents. And I will present production and perception experiments regarding this contrast, and finally close with conclusions about how we can tackle variability and what have we learned about both this particular contrast and intonation more generally. So I'll start, as I often do. People have heard me say this before, with some definitions, because as I mentioned, terms like fundamental frequency, pitch, intonation, and prosody are used quite a lot in the literature and not always with the same meaning. And the result is that sometimes we could be arguing across purposes because we are talking essentially about different phenomena. So at the center of all this is fundamental frequency, or F0, which is based on the rate at which the vocal folds vibrate. Now, this gives rise to the percept of pitch, though there are other ways in which we actually perceive pitch as well. Now, because fundamental frequency depends on physiology, depends, that is, on the length and thickness of the vocal folds, which are largely dependent on your size, your age, and your biological sex. And because of those things, fundamental frequency can be used for indexical purposes, things like performing gender. And we know that there are differences regarding this across cultures. We can also use F0 paralinguistically to do things like show if we are bored, annoyed, angry, etc. Excited. But although all of these functions of F0 are very important to investigate, they are not intonation, and this is the part that I want to stress. Intonation is a specific function of F0, which is grammatical and pertaining to the utterance level. So we're not talking here even about lexical tone. Lexical tone is another function of F0, but again, it is not intonation. Okay. What the functions are will become clear as we go along. So in this respect, intonation is part of prosody, which includes also phrasing, stress, and rhythm. And I put stress in parentheses because you may or may not have stress in a given language. Now, there is a peculiar thing about intonation, which has to do with the fact that although as part of prosody, it's part of what we study when we study speech, and usually when we study speech, we make a distinction between phonetics and phonology. When it comes to prosody and intonation in particular, very often that distinction is blurred in the work. So I'll give an example of that. Let's say if somebody were to show me this picture and ask me what it is, I may respond a pink flamingo. Very often research focuses on the acoustic signal of this, the waveform, the spectrogram, and the pitch contour, which is shown here with a black line. However, and this is the argument that I will be making here, doing this is not sufficient for us to understand what exactly is going on in the signal. We need to understand that there is also an abstract structure, a phonological structure that gives rise to the signal that we see. And so in my work, I follow the principles of the autosegmental metrical theory of intonational phonology. And because this is a mouthful, we normally refer to it as AM. And I'll give an example of what I mean by this. So when you say a pink flamingo, you're not just putting words together or sounds together. You have a mental representation of a structure that helps you produce this utterance. And this mental representation is something like what we see here. You have the words are organized into hierarchical constituents, the prosodic words, the intermediate phrase, and an intonational phrase. So one first thing is that words are grouped into constituents. They're not just beads on a string. Okay, and separately from that, we have the intonation, which is the part that you see at the bottom of the graph right here. Okay, so this abstract representation of intonation is a sequence of tones, highs and lows, which are not meant to represent everything that happens in the pitch track, but give you an abstraction of it. Okay. Now, in order to be able to understand the acoustic signal and to determine these structures, we need to have the interaction, which is part of the laboratory phonology movement. We need to look at the acoustic signal to make reasonable hypotheses about what the mental representations might be, and then we need these mental representations to understand how the signal works. To give an example, on the left, you see a pitch track, which is the black line, with two peaks. These two peaks are what is, here represented with the two high stars, okay? What does that mean? That as a speaker of English, you expect that words like pink and flamingo in this particular instance will be realized with high pitch, and this high pitch will be realized on the stressed syllable of the words. Of course, in pink, there's only one, but in flamingo, there are three. You will go for the middle syllable. You also know that in a statement like a pink flamingo, you need to go down in pitch at the end, and this is what is represented by the low tones at the end. So the tones of this string of highs and lows have diacritics on them, the stars, the percents. The stars just tell you that this is a pitch movement that will be coordinated with a stressed syllable in the acoustic signal, and the dash and the percent tell you that these tones will go to phrasal boundaries. And this is also represented by the curved lines that you see connecting things. So this is, in a nutshell, in a simplified form, what AM assumes. Now, you may think, why do we need such a mental, an abstract representation? Why not just look at pitch? Okay, makes life much easier. The reason is that contours, pitch tracks, can vary substantially from utterance to utterance, even when listeners recognize them as instances of the same tune. And so the only way we can account for this phenomenon is by having some abstract representation that connects those tunes that can look different but mean the same thing and have some characteristics in common. This will become easier if I give you an example, which is here. Let's say you go back to your hometown and you find out that Lee, who was the biggest klutz in your high school class, has become a ballet dancer. You may be very surprised by this and say, Lee, a ballet dancer. Okay, and you can hear a native speaker do that.
Lee, a ballet dancer.
Okay.
Lee, a ballet dancer.
And as you can hear, and any speaker of English would recognize that the pragmatic intent of both tunes is the same. However, if we look at them, we can see that they don't look the same, right? So if we look at the short one on the left, the li, we see that we can characterize it, if we want to see it as a gestalt, as a rise, fall, rise, right? And this is, for example, to a certain extent, what the British School of Intonation used to do. Take these very short utterances and say, well, this is the essential pitch movement. But if this is a rise, fall, rise, if we look at the contour on the right, the long one, we see that it doesn't stretch in a uniform way, right? So what we find is that the main difference between the two tunes is that the short one has a quick dip between the two peaks, whereas the longer tune has a low level stretch. Okay, how can we account for the fact that the short tune does not stretch to just fit the longer utterance, but some parts of it stretch and some stay the same? We can do this by using these representations that AM posits. And the representation here is the one that you see. Low plus high star, which means that you have a pitch accent. And this pitch accent is going to appear on the stress syllable of the most important stress syllable in the utterance. In li, of course, there's only one syllable, so it will occupy only part of that syllable. And in ballet dancer, you will have it taking up the entire of the bal of ballet. All right. Then you know that the tune has to end high, and the highest point is likely to appear at the very end of the utterance, barring some exhalation noise. And then what you're left with is the part in between. And when you don't have a lot of material, as in li, this is going to be a quick dip. But when you have a lot more material, then that low part will stretch to fill the gap between the pitch accent, which is the pitch movement on the stress syllable of the utterance, and the very end of the utterance. Okay. So in this way, we can have the same representation, but have a principled expectation about how it will be realized phonetically on utterances of different length and with different numbers of stress syllables. You should also be able to see that there is an interaction between the tune and the text. If you look at the times of the short and the long utterance, you can see that li, which is just one syllable long, is almost 600 milliseconds, whereas a ballet dancer, which is 5 syllables long, is approximately 1200 milliseconds. In other words, li as a syllable stretches a lot so that you can fit the tune on it, right? So we have this interaction, and we'll come back to these interactions shortly. The other thing that the corollary of using these kinds of representations that we have in AM is that you make a principled decision about which elements of the tune are really relevant. And there will be parts of the tune that are incidental. They're incidental in the sense that, for example, if you have a high tone and you need to go low, there's going to be a fall. But the assumption is that the parts that are shown in blue circles are really incidental. This is the equivalent of saying, if I want to move my arm from here to here, it has to go through all the intermediate stages. But my aim is to go from here to the top, so it doesn't really matter very much what happens in between. Okay, so a decision that we need to make when we do these abstract representations is decide what is really relevant and what is incidental. Now, why do we need to be very careful about how we do this? Is because intonation is becoming increasingly understood to be very important for both acquisition and communication. And I'm giving you here a sprinkling of studies on this. There is increasingly work in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, showing that intonation is one of the elements that are audible in the womb and critical for very early language development, together with rhythm. It is also something that is imitated in crying, which means that infants don't pay attention to the structure of a particular language. So the idea of work like that of Mampé et al. Is that, for example, infants cry differently in French and in German, okay? And imitating patterns that they hear in the ambient language. For adults, we know that it's very important for processing and communication. Intonation can help us understand what are the groupings in an utterance. That is one of the things it does. It tells us where the focus is. It tells us about modality and communicative intent, but it also can help us generate inferences about the conversation that we have with other people, okay? And I'll show you an example that should make this clearer. Importantly, when these expectations are not met, utterances may be seen as odd, which is not terrible, but it's not good, or they may be even seen as inappropriate. And the latter is particularly a problem for L2 speakers and speakers who are neurodivergent. And we have recent reviews showing that, right? Because speakers like that could be saying something that is meant to be positive, but comes across as being, for example, sarcastic. So I'll give you an example of intonation working in communication. This is from the corpus that I will be showing you later on. And this particular exchange comes from a map task where, as you can see on the left, you have two speakers, each of which has a map, but the two of them cannot see each other's maps. If you look at the map on the top, it has a path, and the map on the bottom does not have a path. So the person who has the path has to guide the other person so they can recreate the map, the path in their own map. But the maps are not identical. And if you have high enough resolution or big enough screen, you should be able to see that at the in the top map, there is a pink flamingo, okay, which is missing from the bottom map. Now, in this particular exchange, the person who had the path, person B, kept insisting that A look for the pink flamingo. And at some point, A responded in this way.
I don't have a pink flamingo.
Okay, I don't know if you hear that.
I don't have a pink flamingo.
Okay, normally English, native speakers of English, when they hear this, burst out in laughter. Why? Because it is very clear that the person A is very irritated with person B and is showing this with intonation, and person B gets that immediately, and as soon as they hear the intonation, they respond with a quick okay that actually overlaps with the end of flamingo. So what makes this utterance sound irritated? First of all, the speaker uses two separate phrases. I don't have a pink flamingo. Second, she's doing something that is very atypical for English. She puts an accent on every single word. And this is not typical for English in general, and it's particularly atypical in this particular situation where pink flamingo has been mentioned before, because something that has been mentioned is something that is not normally carrying an accent again, all right? Especially not the kinds of accents that we see here. The fact that the speaker focuses and accents every word shows an insistence that, you know, you should get it, that this is what I've been telling you. Note, for example, that in this particular case, the speaker does it with intonation, but they could have done it with an expletive. I don't have a expletive flamingo, okay, to get the same kind of irritation across. But intonation is sufficient. And this is the kind of thing that, from my perspective, is the most interesting part. How do we generate these inferences? How do other people understand them? Okay. Now, I hope I've shown you that intonation is important for communication and for acquisition, but what we see in the literature is that very often people, the researchers, don't treat it that way. And I'd like to address a few of the approaches that I've seen when I talk about intonation. One of the things I hear, oh, it's unimportant. I hope I've shown you that this is false. You cannot work on spoken communication without looking at intonation. The other thing that I see very often is to treat intonation as optional, like the icing on the cake. But we know that it's practically impossible to speak without using intonation. Even if you don't phonate, a person of speech will be created and will be linguistically interpreted. Okay, so it is not an optional thing that you can switch on and off. Sometimes what we see is what I mentioned in the beginning, looking at the phonetics, looking at the F0 track only, and this, however, has the problem that it bypasses phonology, and it means that there is an assumption that there's no linguistic structure there. And as I have shown you, if we do this, we're missing a lot of, we cannot make significant generalizations that we actually do need to make. The final thing I've seen very often is, oh, this is too difficult, I don't deal with it. And what I will devote the vast majority of the talk from now on is to persuade you that it is difficult, but no more difficult than other aspects of speech if we adopt the right approach. Okay, a little bit before we move on about where do these approaches come from? Why do we think of intonation as so different? In my view, it comes from our alphabetical understanding, which is reflected, for example, in the IPA chart as well, and is a very Western-centric understanding of speech that prioritizes vowels and consonants. And this is also reflected in the traditional terms that we use. Very often people talk about segments and suprasegmentals. I personally do not use the term suprasegmentals. I prefer to say prosody. And the reason is what you see there. Segments or segmentals implies that vowels and consonants are discrete, whereas suprasegmentals gives the impression of some elements that are amorphous and sit on top of the segments. So if you want an analogy, we often, I think, we deep down think of speech in this way, that vowels and consonants are like your basic vanilla cake. You have it there, you can slice it. And then the suprasegmentals are the icing, and this icing can change as you want it to be. So for example, the two pictures on the right can have the same cake underneath. This also implies that that cake underneath does not change, but this is not the case because we have a lot of evidence that there is a lot of interaction between the tune and the text, and the tune can affect the characteristics of the segments. As I showed you earlier with Li, you get an elongation of that vowel, which is necessary for intonation. Okay. Now, in addition, since language is seen as a discrete combinatorial system, this is something that is drummed into us as linguists, it is very easy to see anything that is considered amorphous as being around the edge of language, not being central, okay? Because the central part are the bits that are Lego blocks that you can put together. And this gives rise to metaphors like intonation as a half-tamed savage, which is found at the end of language. And these are perpetuated without people even thinking, what does that mean? Why do I say this about intonation? Yeah. So I would like to propose a different type of analogy, which is this. Speech is not a cake with icing on top. It's a baklava. Why is it a baklava? Because you need to have different layers. It is made of different layers. Remember the prosodic structure, the hierarchical structure I mentioned, though the boundaries can be fuzzy. And the prosody, the rhythm, the intonation part is the syrup that binds it all together, without which you cannot have speech. And this is very important because prosody is not something that you can take off like the icing on the cake. It's an integral part of the speech signal. Okay. So I hope then that I have persuaded you by now that these three arguments for not looking at intonation, ignoring it, or not looking at the phonology of it don't really work. The last one that is left is that intonation is difficult, but I would like to argue that it's difficult but manageable. And one of the first ways in which we can start with some principles about how we can manage the variability. The first one is training. Okay, I very often see people who think that because they've downloaded Pratt, they can do intonation without actually looking at anything else other than the pitch track provided in Pratt. But you need to be trained to understand how the system works. Nobody, for example, wakes up one morning and says, oh, I will work on the syntax of ellipses. I don't need to know anything about syntactic theory. I'll just wing it. But many people work on intonation by just winging it. The other part is patience and perseverance. We actually need to take a lot of time, as we will see with data. And finally, we need appropriate methods and assumptions. For me, the most important assumption is that intonation is part of phonology, because this means that abstract representations will not be phonetically transparent all the time. It doesn't mean that everything that we see in the phonetic signal we need to turn into an abstract representation. This is one part. And the other part is that the phonetic realizations of intonation, like all phonetic realizations of all types of phenomena, will exhibit both variation, that is systematic linguistic driven changes, and variability, okay, which you can think of as more random or as noise, okay? And there are many reasons why this will happen, as you will see there, okay? Adopt this approach of starting with the assumption that intonation has phonology and taking it from there to move on to do experiments, to do our analysis. Tint for tame intonation, a play on Bollinger's Half-Tamed Savage, to bring home the point that intonation is not savage, but tame. And here in the rest of the talk, I will give you some examples of the kinds of variability that we deal with depending on the linguistic variety, style, the individual, and the intonation category. So I'll do this by looking at high star and low high star accents in English, and I will refer to them also as high and rising, and this will become clear in the next slide. Now, English intonation has been studied for, in modern terms, for over 100 years. One of the very first modern approaches is that of Daniel Jones in 1909, who traced F0 by using his ears and gramophone records. Okay. Today, a lot of people work on the autosegmental metrical theory of intonational phonology, as mentioned, and for English, which is the first description that we have in Pure Hybrid 80, there is an assumption that there is a distinction in the phonology between high accents and low high accents. Okay, what is the difference between the two phonetically? The high accents mean that the accented syllable shown here with a gray rectangle is going to be high and maybe show a small rise, whereas the low high star accent means that there is a dip at the beginning and then you have the rise. Now in this system, the phonological distinction is meant to be also reflecting a pragmatic distinction. And roughly, based on Pierhamid and Hirschberg, we can say that the assumed distinction between the two accents is that the accent, the high accent is used for new information, and the low high accent is used for contrastive information. So if you ask me what's new and I replied, my mom bought me a car, I will use a high star accent on mom. But if you said, did your dad buy you a car? I may reply, my mom bought me a car, okay? And in this case, I will use the low high accent. Now, I have used American spelling here because this is an assumption about how things work in American English. My project is about British English, and in British English, we have different analyses. So in the traditional analysis of the British school, after Daniel Jones's work and an analysis that he didn't himself fully espouse, these accents that we just saw as high or rising are all considered to be false, with the high false being more lively. Kochansky et al., which is one of the papers from the Ivy corpus, does admit that there are rising accents as well as falling accents in British English, but they argue that there's no difference between the two types. Bob Ladd, on the other hand, with many of his colleagues, has also worked on these accents in British English and says there are rises because he's coming, from the AM tradition, but he argues also that the extent of the rise shows more emphasis. Okay, so there's no agreement as to what the shape of the accents are phonetically and what they do pragmatically. Okay, now this is not hair splitting. It goes right into the heart of what we're talking about here, because it has to do with how do we carve up the F0 curve. When, as an analyst, you're faced with a red line that you see here, which is the I don't have a pink flamingo one, how do you know which are the critical points that you need to take into consideration, which are incidental, okay? And you need to be able to do this in a way that reflects what native speakers do in interaction and how they learn the system. So this goes to the heart of the problem that we have been dealing with for decades now, which is how do we relate phonetics, the concrete, the gradient, the variable, with phonology, the abstract, the discrete, the invariant. Okay. So how did we handle this? First of all, we used production data and we made some changes to the typical paradigm of how this is done. They're not exactly innovations, but they are changes. The first one is that we used unscripted speech. We do use lab speech to ask specific questions, but in this particular case, it was important to have natural data. And we have about 2,500 accents in the current corpus, with a new corpus being analyzed as we speak. The second thing we did is very often when people say we use unscripted speech, they just talk about one task, and usually that's a map task. Instead, we had people take part in a number of different tasks, and the reason why we wanted the tasks to be varied is because earlier work of mine, shown here, has indicated that the kind of task we ask people to do affects how often they use melodic events and what function these melodic events have. The tasks that we used were, first of all, having people use story cubes. They're cubes like the ones that you see on the slide, and narrate stories. So it was all new information, but quite wacky. And then dialogues. One is the classic map task, as I showed you earlier, and the other was a discussion between two participants about unusual objects. So the first task, the map task, can give you a lot of contrastive accents because the two maps do not coincide and people have to argue about what to do, whereas the unusual objects is kind of more neutral. The third thing that we did differently is we didn't use the holistic annotation that is traditional in AM. So normally you bring up a file in Prat and you process at the same time the F0, the amplitude, the duration, the context in which the utterance has been uttered, and so on. And this is, of course, what native speakers do when they communicate with one another, but we're not native speakers, we're analysts. So we needed to break this down into different steps and look at a specific hypothesis. The hypothesis we wanted to test is whether the low-high star accent is used contrastively, that is, if there is an information structure distinction that high star and low-high star represent. In order to break down the holistic part, we separated the pragmatic annotation from the annotation of the accents phonetically. The pragmatic annotation was done on orthographic transcripts without taking account how we would say a particular utterance, but based only on the context. I can give you more details if anybody has questions. And the phonetic annotation was done based on the F0 track. And then we brought the two together in the way that you see here. So if you listen to this, oops.
And I've got a yellow loon bird and a wallaby.
Okay, so what you see here is that you have two tiers. One has NC for non-contrastive, because all of these accents are new in this particular context. And this was determined by the written transcript. And then the tier underneath tells you if the accent is a high star or a low high star. Okay, so when listening, we first decided if there was if a particular word was accented. Then, based on the F0, if it was a high star or a low high star. If it was something else, it was not annotated. And then for the accents that were already annotated as high star or low high star, we imported the pragmatic labels. Note also that we didn't look at tonal targets. We used entire prosodic words as our level of analysis. Okay. Now, we use functional principal component analysis. I clearly don't have any time to talk about this. I have some slides if anybody's interested. But what I will be showing here is the analysis we do using GAMS. So here is first the analysis of the accents based on their phonetic labels. And what you have in gray is the accented vowel, so we can see where the accented vowel is. And you can see that the smooths are very different. For the low-high, you have a rising falling curve. For the high, it's basically a fall. Okay, and we have a height difference between the two of them. Okay, now this says that we did a good job separating the highs from the low highs in the analysis. Statistically, the difference is in the stretch that you see between the two red lines. Okay, so quite a lot of difference between the two. But the question is, if the same difference that we see here applies if we classify the accents based on their pragmatic function. And for that, we had these three categories: non-contrastive accents, which would mean new and sometimes given if an accent was present; contrastive, which means that you could think of contrastive ones are the ones where you are selecting an item from a small set of implied alternatives; and correctives, when a participant actively corrected somebody else about what they should be placed in the common ground. So the arrow tells you that we have an increasing degree of contrastivity in the accents. Now, if the assumption that the non-contrastive accents are primarily high and the corrective and contrastives are low highs, then we would expect these two categories shown in purple to have a curve, a smooth that looks kind of like the low high star. That's not what we got. Okay, now the non-contrastives and the contrastives, the red and blue lines, were identical. There was no statistically significant difference between the two of them. And the main difference was between the correctives and the other two examples. So when people were correcting, there was more of a dip perhaps at the very beginning, although also lower scaling. And between the non-contrastives and the correctives, there was a bigger stretch that was different. And in all cases, there's more of a dip for the corrective accents. Okay, but it's very clear that both accents with the high shape and the low high shape are used for all the three pragmatic purposes. So the correctives are the only ones that are slightly different. Now, this agrees with work done by Griffens-Copeteas quite recently, though they found much clearer results because they did not use spontaneous speech, but actually scripted data where people really were correcting others. Now, if the whole thing is that just the corrective ones are different, why is there so much disagreement in the literature? And the answer to that is that there are different accents, different purposes to the accents, and a lot of individual variation. And this is what we'll turn to next. So the low-high accents are not used just for information structure purposes. They can be used like that. And here's an example of a low-high accent.
I've got a winding lane.
Okay, so in this case, a speaker is asked if they have a narrow lane and reply,
I've got a winding lane.
Okay, so a different type of lane. This is another contrastive, this is a contrastive accent rather than corrective. Here the example.
There's a torch on the end as well. To find the screws. There's a torch on the end as well. To find the screws.
So in this case, the two participants were looking at the object that you see here in the picture. They had figured out it's metallic and therefore it can be used to pick up screws. And then this particular speaker figures out that there is a light, to find the screws, where to find the screws is contrasted with picking up the screws. But you can also see there is another accent.
There's a torch on the end as well.
As well, the screws. Right? Which is used as an intensifier here. And this is something that Daniel Jones had noted for English in the early 20th century, that very often discourse particles like that tend to have these accents. We see the same in this example.
She saw loads and loads of jumping fish.
Okay? So loads and loads of jumping fish. In this case, all the information is coming from the story cubes, but loads and loads is exaggerated with these low-high accents, whereas jumping fish has plain downstepped high accents. The low-highs can also be used to mark something that is unexpected in context.
It was Rapunzel.
Okay?
It was Rapunzel.
Where, all of a sudden Rapunzel comes up. A lot of these accents came up in the story cubes because in the story cubes you have these wacky stories that you have to create. So each of the analyses that we've seen so far from the British School and so on captures some of these functions, but you need a lot of data and people in different communicative situations to capture all of them. So for example, Daniel Jones had talked about the intensifiers, but most other people have not even given it a lot of attention. The unexpected one is something new that we found in the present corpus. Now, so we see that the accents have different functions. Do all participants, all speakers of the language, equally sensitive to these differences? We looked at this in perception by using rapid prosody transcription, in which untrained listeners hear utterances and select which words sound prominent to them. Normally, this is done post hoc. You first have people tell you which are the prominent words, and then you look at what the characteristics are. We did it the other way around. We looked specifically at accents that we had categorized in the way we've just seen, because what we wanted was to use a task that was not terribly meta-linguistic. We didn't want to ask people, do you use this accent there, or what does this accent mean? But rather, what we wanted to see is if native speakers of English are sensitive to the difference between high star and low high star, because there is existing work that the low high stars sound more prominent. And this is something that tallies with the idea of Ladd that low highs are just exaggerated versions of highs. What did we find? We didn't find exactly what we thought would be finding. So what we found worked well if we looked only if the type of accent and the function matched. So if we looked at high non-contrastive accents, these were highly unlikely to be marked as prominent, whereas the low-high contrastives were highly likely to be marked as prominent. But because we had separated the function from the form, we had these categories of high contrastives and low-high non-contrastives, which you can see are kind of in the middle. So we were kind of taken aback by this because we expected that participants would choose one or the other. And we wanted to see if this was due to individual variation. Indeed, that seems to be the case. So we plotted random slopes for the pragmatic distinction and the phonetic distinction extracted from the statistical modeling, and we find that there are participants who decide that words are prominent if they are contrastive in an utterance. There were other participants that do the opposite. So you can see now the lines go in the opposite direction. So these people are more likely to mark words as prominent if they have a low-high accent. And finally, there are people who are kind of in the middle. Okay. Now, our next question was what drives this? And so we decided to look at two types of individual traits. sensitivity to phonetic detail and sensitivity to pragmatic information, because these were things that others have found before. So for sensitivity to pragmatic detail, to phonetic detail, we used mini prompts which test musicality, and we also use the autism quotient. For sensitivity to pragmatic information, we use the empathy quotient. We had about 95 participants, and we had 80% power approximately for all of them. So what you see here on the right is the density plots for the scores of our participants in the 3 tests. And I don't have time to go into this, but what we can reasonably say is that these are distributions for neurotypical adults. Okay. What did we find? The exact same results. Okay. We got the same results at the aggregate level and the same results at the individual level. What affected those results? It looks like the individual traits that we tested did have an effect. So if you look first at the top left, we have the results for the mini prompts and the probability of marking an item as prominent. What we see is that the high accents are very unlikely to be marked as prominent, but the more higher your musicality score gets, the more likely you are to mark low highs as prominent. So these rises are more salient. I find it more helpful to think in terms of what happens with the people at the end of the scale. So when they're not very musical, the difference between the 2 types of accents seem not to be very salient to these participants. When it comes to the AQ, we again see that the highs are less likely to be marked as prominent than the low highs, but now we see another difference. The higher you score on the AQ, the more likely you are to mark the highs, which are have very small phonetic differences relative to the rest of the contour, as being prominent. So in other words, people of low musicality or testing high on the AQ tend to not see the difference between the high and the low high as being terribly salient. Similar things apply with the empathy quotient, with people high on the empathy scale being particularly sensitive to non-contrastive accents, but those low on the empathy scale not making so much of a distinction in terms of the prominence of these accents. So a way to think about this is that the difference between the accents, either in terms of form or in terms of meaning, is not equally salient to all listeners of English. So summary and conclusions. What can we say about the accents based on these results? Phonetically, we do seem to have high and rising accents, though the accent shape is not identical in British and American English. Okay, and this kind of phonetic detail is something that we need to pay attention to, so that we don't say, oh, this is about English. It is about standard Southern British English in particular. Okay, in terms of function, we found that the accents can be used correctively and generally can be used to mark contrast, but they can also be used as an intensifier, and they can be used to mark the unexpected, which is something that I've highlighted because previous analysis had not talked much about it. One way to think about this as a conclusion is that clearly in British English, the distinction between high star and low high star is not particularly focused on the information structure distinction between new and contrastive, and that if we want to generalize about what the low high does, we can say that it marks the exceptional. Okay. Now, I haven't actually answered whether we need whether we actually need to represent the rise. One could argue, well, one is a high fall and the other is a low fall. Okay, but it is clear that our listeners think of the rise as being salient. They don't treat it as being incidental, and there are phonological reasons I can go into in the questions if anybody's interested, that make it more parsimonious to think of the accents as one involving a rise and the other not. The individual variation tells us that individuals do create different grammars, and therefore based on the generalizations that they make. So for people who are sensitive to the phonetic detail and the functions, they can think of them, the accents as being very different. Those who don't think of the phonetic distinction or the accent or the pragmatic distinction as particularly salient may form one category, and others may create a fuzzy or marginal contrast. We know that this applies across varieties of English and across languages as well. So individuals and may shape the inventory of the language at some point. Further, even if individuals have the same grammar, it is important to note that not all speakers use the system in the same way. Some speakers may be more helpful, may be willing to highlight things more for participants. And very briefly, here are two examples of a very lively speaker and a not so lively one.
As she went towards her nest, she found another set of eggs, and she thought, these look like dinosaur eggs.
So you can hear all the low-high stars here, but listen to this example. They're both from the same type of communicative situation.
He saw a fingerprint, so told Detective Turtle, who discovered it was Mammoth's fingerprint.
Okay. So this is rather flat. So we need to use a lot of participants and a lot of different types of tasks to get to generalizations. So to conclude, intonation is not a peripheral curiosity. It is critical for language and speech and for understanding language acquisition and spoken communication. By dismissing it or reducing it to just phonetic measurements, we impoverish our understanding of intonation itself, but also of our understanding of language, speech, acquisition, and communication in both typical and atypical populations. So it is imperative that we study intonation, even though it is challenging and time-consuming. In order to be able to understand intonation, we need to fully espouse its linguistic nature and stop othering it, not think of it as being exotic or different from other aspects of the speech signal. If we do this, it means that essentially we accept that there is an abstract structure that is combined with variable phonetic realization, as with every other aspect of speech. Here I've presented methodologies and assumptions that we use in Sprint to try to handle variability. First of all, assume that melodic events and tunes don't have a one-to-one relationship with meaning. This is something that we have known for over 100 years, but very often it's forgotten when people talk about question intonation or negation intonation or focus intonation, which assumes there is one tune. So if you have that assumption, you may find you may think there's a lot more variability in the signal than there really is. We made principal separations of form and meaning to try to understand the relationship between the two rather than treating them holistically. We focused on one variety rather than assuming that we can actually look at English in general. We tested specific hypotheses and used spontaneous data and a variety of communicative tasks in order to reach general conclusions. We used new approaches, especially FPCA and GAMS, to analyze pitch curves, and we looked at larger sections of the pitch track rather than focusing on tonal targets. And of course, we investigated the role of individual variation in production and perception. By combining the above, we can get to a clearer understanding of a century-long controversy in English intonation, and I think this can provide a blueprint for ways in which we can tackle the challenges that the study of intonation represents, including the study of its variability. So thank you very much for all the time and for letting me run over the limit. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much, Amalia, for this very clear didactic presentation. And we have some time for questions from YouTube. Do we have any questions?
Yes, there is one question. A minute, please. I will copy here.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, please. Okay.
Oh, and considering unscripted text and the nature of the task while talking to the data. That's a good question. For now, not yet, no. Unfortunately, because the tasks take so long to analyze, it is not possible to look at large amounts of data in different varieties, but the plan is to do so, yes.
Nice.
Maybe the person who asked the question has any specific types of tasks that they have in mind or methods? If they're there.
Pedro, if...
Okay. I will, while Pedro answers in the chat, I will copy here the other questions, okay?
Okay, sure. I will just say while we do this, that this is one of the most interesting questions, how people with different systems manage to communicate with one another across varieties.
Yes.
Okay, yes, that's an interesting question. Have I tried to synthesize an F0 tone like high or low, high start to vary that listeners interpret the curve according to the expected pragmatic content function? Personally, we have not done that yet. There is plenty of work where people use it in I will answer Martin's question. That show that the low highs are more likely to lead to interpretations of contrastiveness. Okay, but it is not something that is necessary. And this is the tricky part about intonation, that you interpret it in context, right? So, and in this particular case, the context is not only what other people are saying and what you're likely to mean, but also this has to do with the tune itself. So, for example, very often a low high, an accent that is followed by de-accentuation. If I were to say it's a pink flamingo, I can use a high star on pink. But if I don't put an accent on flamingo, I'm already making my utterance contrastive. I'm saying it's a pink, not a gray flamingo. Yeah. So it's a good question. It's a very difficult one to answer. And we're trying to think of ways of doing that. I think eye tracking may be the best way, because you don't want to ask people meta-linguistic questions like, do you think this is what's happening? And if you give them dialogues, you very often have ask them to do it backwards. So this person answered, what do you think this response means? So it can be very tricky to do. And this is one of the most difficult parts about intonation research. So Martin says, could you give more detail of why you argue for rise versus no rise in the high and low high distinction? The highs don't have a rise, so we don't need it. The low highs, we could say that they have a rise because you need to go high in order to have a high fall. But we find them also very early on in utterances, in British English, even utterance initially. So the only way to explain the rise in this case is to say, well, you start low and then you rise, so you can have the high fall, or you can say there is a high boundary, a low boundary tone on the left, or you have to say, this is really rising. But we are going to be doing more experiments, both in production and perception, to look more at the stability of this rise. Yes. As its own prosodic word. I didn't treat it as it's not that it's not a prosodic word. So the question is, you didn't treat dancer as its own prosodic word. Should it have had its own pitch accent? I think that in ballet dancer, there is no accent on. That's my interpretation of the utterance, that there was no accent on dancer in this particular case. So it is a prosodic word, but it's not an accented prosodic word. Actually, I'm not sure I would even say it's a prosodic word, because I would treat ballet dancer as a compound. So it would depend on the realization. If somebody wanted to say he's a ballet dancer, that would be different from he's a ballet dancer. So in one case, there is no accent on dancer, in the other, there is.
Okay, and there is an answer, the answer by Pedro Henrique for your question.
I meant that regarding how spontaneous the data may be, whether the questions there since yes, so we have scripted data where people read dialogues with somebody else, but we also have, we try not to use the term spontaneous, because some people get upset when you use spontaneous for tasks like the map task, because you are giving people some prompts. So we say it's unscripted. We don't know what they're going to say. And I think, having listened to a lot of data, that people get quite caught up in the task, and they don't pay attention to how they say things. And this is what we want. We want for them to be as unguarded as possible in their speech. But we do need to have some kind of some kind of prompts. I have some fantastic data, recent data. For example, on UpTalk, we used both peculiar objects and objects that are very familiar. So we have a very nice narrative of somebody talking about the kinds of phones they had throughout their lives. So they're talking about mobile phones and using UpTalk through the narrative. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do. Have we done this with intonation and prosody in modern Greek? Yes, we have. And in fact, this is what I was hinting at when I said that although in English, the distinction between high star and low high star seems to be kind of fuzzy, the Greek data are much clearer. And for example, we have Erasmus students coming in, helping with annotation. If you give them Greek data to listen to, Greek speakers, their interpretation of low high as contrastive is immediate, so you don't have to train them. They get it immediately. So it's very different story from what we find in English. But I should add, before I answer Marta's question, that one of the things we need to be very careful about is the tasks. So what we find is that culturally some tasks work better than others in different situations. So to give an example, the map task does not work well in Greek. We could not get people to do it the way English people, our English participants did. We changed the instructions 3 times to try to get them to think in terms of maps, perhaps because we don't learn how to do this at school. People had difficulty with it. They were particularly good at doing the task with the peculiar objects and finding wacky explanations of what they would do. They enjoyed that very much. So you can use different tasks. I think tasks need to be piloted before they are used to make sure that they work for the population. Any acoustic cues? Yes, absolutely. Your analysis of high, low, high. To explain individual perceptual differences. Yes, Marta, thank you for the question. We do indeed plan to do this. We have already done it for Greek. I presented the data at the ASA meeting in Sydney. It's work with Nahu from my lab. And we find that for example, the low-high accent in Greek is consistently associated with longer duration. We have another accent which is high star low, and for most speakers it is also accompanied by breathy voice. Okay, but these features, such as voice quality, and duration are not consistent for all speakers. So our next question is, what makes some speakers use these additional cues, whereas other speakers just use F0? So far, we have not been able to do that because the samples were not large enough, but we now have relatively large samples for production work with over 30, with about 30 participants. So we are also collecting personality test data, AQ, EQ, and musicality to try to see if this is a matter of being more sensitive to the cues and therefore using it more, or it's something to do with being more helpful, if you like, to your interlocutors, giving them these additional redundant cues. And we plan to do this both with perception, production data, and see how these cues are used in perception. So if listeners can use them, and whether listeners with different cognitive styles actually can use them more or less. But I think it's like, to me, it's very exciting because it shows that we have impoverished our study of intonation and we can make it much richer.
Thank you so much, Amalia. It's 7 minutes past 6 p.m. In your place. Thank you so much for the audience, for this great talk. It was very didactical, very exhaustive, and very interesting. Thank you so much. It was a great time.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for your fantastic questions. They were giving me food for thought. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Bye.